The blue cities present us with a very difficult problem, but it's a familiar problem. If you go back 100 years ago when people were moving to the cities, what was the big problem? Inflation, cost of housing, cost of food. So that hasn't changed. The trouble is that these are very expensive places to live. There is no way to make New York City affordable, as you and I have talked about on your radio program. So how do you help people? I think, honestly, I would encourage them to move to other communities. There is no way for a low-income household to survive in New York City. It's just impossible. And they try and subsidize it. They try and, make it tolerable. But there's no way for a developer to build new affordable housing in Queens or Brooklyn, New York, because of the cost of acquiring the property and building. It's just too high.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. For anyone who doubts people respond to incentives, look at the reactions domestically and internationally to Trump's presidential victory. The 3,000-person migrant caravan moving from southern Mexico to America's southern border broke up. New York City Mayor Eric Adams eliminated the city's food voucher program for illegal immigrants. All of a sudden, EU President Ursula von der Leyen recognized that maybe European nations buy too much of their natural gas from Russia and should buy more of it from the United States. Shoe retailer Steve Madden is reducing its production in China by half and moving that production to Vietnam and Mexico. Leftist podcasters like David Pakman are complaining about getting ghosted as they hemorrhage subscribers who bought their doomsday predictions and are now throwing up their hands. Risk assets ticked up on renewed optimism that extending the Trump tax cuts and unleashing Elon Musk on the administrative state mark a move away from government and a return to the animal spirits. But only Barack Obama gets Nobel Prizes for potential. The rest of us, including Trump, are bound by what we produce. So what sort of economic turnaround should we realistically expect, and how fast? Will it get worse still before it gets better? What policy fights will be determinative in reducing Americans' cost of living and improving their quality of life? To answer these questions and others, we're pleased to be joined by Christopher Whalen, a gentleman who understands the theoretical while he lives in the practical. Whalen is an investment banker and chairman of Whalen Global Advisors, LLC. He's also the author of Ford Men, From Inspiration to Enterprise, and the editor for the Institutional Risk Analyst. Chris, thanks for joining us. Welcome. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dan.
So, give us your reaction to the geopolitical fallout from Trump's victories, I guess, surprising as it was in certain circles.
Well, I live in the world of mortgages and banks and financial institutions. I think people are still in shock. They can't believe that the Democrats literally handed us the entire policy landscape on a silver platter. We're going to control the Congress and the presidency. I can't even remember the last time Republicans controlled the whole table. So it's a huge turnabout. And I think that you're probably going to see the administration undoing progressive initiatives for at least the first 6 to 12 months, because there were so many bad policies in the Biden years. And I think you'll see considerable lift, both in terms of interest rates, the economy, the profitability of many businesses. We were going through a Spanish Inquisition during Biden, which I think is part of the reason that Kamala Harris lost so badly. So now that that's over, once we sweep aside some of the more recent progressive nonsense, I think you're going to see some very exciting things. Taxes, obviously, but also if Donald Trump and Elon Musk can start making a dent in the budget deficit, interest rates are going to fall. So Trump won't even have to talk about the Fed. It'll be irrelevant because the government has been spending and borrowing so much money. If we start reducing that number, Dan, the interest rates are going to collapse because we're used to selling $1.5 trillion a year in new debt. So I think it's amazing. It's going to take us a couple more weeks just to suck it all in and figure out what's going on.
And just to rewind for a second about your world, the financial sector. I mean, how are these number crunchers surprised by what the numbers were telling us, including the betting markets? To some extent, I'm having a little time processing the surprise that is present in so many sectors.
I think the banks and also many other businesses were so used to being subservient to the progressive state. They were so used to having regulators fine them for no reason at all. The CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, being the chief example of this. Elizabeth Warren wanted a way to punish business, and that's why they created that agency. So now that that's no longer the case, I think people are stunned. I have been exhorting my friends in the housing sector to fight for years, but they had taken a position, said, well, it can't get worse. Yes, it can. So now that the Republicans have run the whole table, I hope the business community is going to become a little bit more confident and a little bit more willing to push back in the future. And the only way we can do this is to show people what things are like without progressive sand in the gears, essentially. I think GDP growth is going to take off simply because we don't have regulators getting in our way.
Just thinking about that, and you mentioned the CFPB. Trump said recently on one of these policy videos that he's been putting out, which are actually quite interesting, that he reiterated he wants to eliminate the Department of Education. I mean, we've heard this before: Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of Education. Presidential candidates, presidents going back to Reagan have said that hasn't really happened. What would be, from your perspective in the financial sector, if you were making recommendations and Elon Musk where to focus, would like CFPB be one of them? That's a relatively recent development. Other sorts of things you think would reduce the government centrism in our country and unleash those animal spirits that I talked about in the open?
Well, the consumer agency does have a role. It's just that when we use it for political punishment, it's just extraordinary and really unacceptable. I think you need to put a commission structure in place instead of having a single director so that we can neuter the agency and moderate its swings between different administrations in the White House. And then the question is, how do we change the law? The CFPB has to be subject to the budget process. We can't have the Fed paying their bills, especially when the Fed has lost over $100 billion so far, thanks to Jay Powell. But I think, what you touched on before, Department of Education, Department of Energy, these are all areas where we should push the authority back to the states, get the federal government out of the way. If the federal government does anything, they should set standards and help raise money. Those are the two things that they're reasonably good at. But when they get too involved in the day-to-day management of the economy, it's a train wreck. You could do this with at least half a dozen different government departments in Washington. You could get rid of the CFPB and just have the states enforce their own fraud laws. I would think of that. But I think the big bonanza using Elon Musk is going to be defense. He understands defense. He's a defense contractor. So once you let him loose and say, go find the money we're wasting, number one. And then two, we need Congress to give us the authority to reprogram funds across the board. The Office of Management Budget.
Change procurement rules.
Change procurement rules, but give the Office of Management and Budget and their counterparts inside DOD and other agencies the ability to say, this isn't working. We really need to reprogram this. Let the Congress know. And then move on from there, because that's how normal organizations run their budget. I'll give you another great example. One of the key things that's going to be coming down the road since the Supreme Court decision on Loper Bright, where we pushed aside Chevron deference and now judges have to make the call instead of federal agencies. Trump is going to sign the executive order, the revision to 12866, which is going to force federal agencies to report up to the White House and to OMB when Congress hasn't given them explicit instructions. So, for example, Jay Powell, he has instructions on monetary policy, but on bank regulatory issues, no. So every federal agency in the government would have to report up to the White House on things like Basel, broker deposits. There's a whole list of issues, right? And at least we have the possibility then, Dan, of having a consistent policy for banks and non-banks to deal with. What's wrong with that? People liked in the past having confusion and competition between agencies, but that's very expensive. Another key thing is going to be Trump's executive order, Schedule F, where he's allowed to recharacterize civil servants who are involved in policy, who are involved in confidential matters, things of this nature, he can clean house. I have a list, by the way, which I've shared with some of our colleagues, because the housing sector is rife with progressive idiocy. We need to get rid of these people. And now we have the opportunity to do it. So I hope conservatives aren't going to be too shocked by the fact that they have power again, and they're going to use it. That's my hope.
On the housing piece, because so much of the discussion about this inflationary environment we've been in the last several years has been about the unaffordability of housing.
Yes.
I mean, there's another agency that's been rumored for the chopping block under GOP leadership that's never quite happened. Going back to Jack Kemp, that's HUD. But so
no, I worked for Jack. Remember?
I know. So on housing policy though, what do you want to see? Because I think the overriding question to all of this is, okay, I'm open-minded. We want Trump to make the changes that get us moving in the direction we were in before COVID in his first term. But when am I going to start seeing the residual benefits of reduced cost of living that's improving my life, improving my access to affordable housing, improving my wages so that I can keep up with the price of groceries? What are the policies he needs to focus on to affect that, and how quickly can we see those effects?
Well, the big problem with housing is the Fed. The Fed did too much. During COVID, they provided the liquidity to help us help millions of consumers who couldn't pay their bills. And we weren't going to foreclose on those consumers. So we had to figure out a way to make the system work without having, defaults on Ginnie Mae securities. Okay. That's what it came down to. Unfortunately, the Fed, being very progressive, did too much, and they kept going, and they forced home prices up dramatically. Home prices are still going up in many parts of the country this year after several years of supposed tightening by the Fed. So I think you got to go to the source, Dan. And ultimately, I think we need to put limitations on the progressive imagination of the Federal Reserve Board. We need to reform the Fed. Now, with housing, I'd like to see Ginnie Mae spun out of HUD and turned into a real agency. It needs to pay its people market rates, because that's the only way we can hire good people. I'd like to see Ginnie Mae take over all of the insurance functions for mortgages. That includes Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Once you do that, you can take Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. But you can't leave those securities, which are currently sovereign securities rated by the United States, right? You can't have them all downgraded if the GSEs come out of conservatorship. That's not going to work. So I think if we reorganize HUD and make it look, especially Ginnie Mae, and make it look a lot more like the Fannie and Freddie in terms of how they function in the marketplace, I think that'd be a big step forward. And I think you'd see enormous support for that among the mortgage industry.
When you talk about reforming the Fed, I mean, it was interesting last week when Powell announced that quarter point rate cut. He was asked about whether or not he feels like, even though he's got a term through 26, he serves at the pleasure of the president. If Trump wanted you to leave, would you leave? And he said, in a word, no. And, he's been there for more than a decade now. And I think the record among most industry experts is mixed at best. And so what is that, from the libertarian perspective, there's been this audit the Fed movement, eliminate the Fed, eliminate that too, eliminate the central bank movement for a long time. But what does Jay Powell's response last week tell you about the Fed and what it would take to advance the sort of reforms that you suggest are needed?
Well, like most Fed chairmen, Powell is trying to protect the institution. But conservatives should have no illusions about what the Fed is. The Fed is a socialist, progressive institution that was created really as a fluke of history right before World War I. And I think that you got to understand that it's ultimately a source of inflation. That's what the Fed does. So if we start constraining the Fed, there's a good and a bad. On the one hand, you're going to have less inflation. You're going to have a less volatile economy, less volatile financial markets. But when you have situations like COVID or 2008, you kind of want them to act, because otherwise we end up going into a debt deflation and you have a depression. So the question is, how do we limit the Fed's actions without taking them off the table entirely, without making it possible?
Although, just to interrupt, I mean, because this is sort of an interesting thought experiment. Had we not had the Fed, would we have had lockdowns? Because the Fed was the backstop for the lockdowns.
Oh, that's true, but you would have had millions of people defaulting on their mortgages. You would have had defaults on by many non-bank servicers and issuers who didn't have the cash. Let me remind you of something. When Donald Trump declared the emergency at the end of his term, that basically said that Americans didn't have to pay their mortgages and they didn't have to pay rent. So, for about 30 days, everybody in the mortgage industry was holding their breath, looking kind of sick and nauseous because they didn't know how they were going to survive. But then suddenly, the fact of low interest rates and a huge tidal wave of refinancing and new home purchases, that cash flow made it all better. That cash flow enabled us to help those people. And the industry didn't get paid for it, but they made a lot of new mortgages. So it worked out okay. The problem is Ben Bernanke, quantitative easing, buying this huge portfolio of securities, including mortgage backs, which are still sitting there. Right now, the mortgage-backed securities, if you measure the duration, which is a technical term, are bigger than the Treasury portfolio of the Fed. That's unconscionable. Ben Bernanke violated the basic rule of central bankers, which is you got to keep your assets and your liabilities short. What did he do? He bought a bunch of mortgage backs, which had an effective duration of a year. Today, they have a duration of almost 20 years. Jay Powell will be dead and gone before those securities run off the books of the Fed. So I think we have to put limits on how they act in the marketplace. Let me give you another example. At a certain point, they were paying more on their reserves to banks, and the Treasury was getting paid on, was paying on Treasury bills.
T-bills. Yeah.
Yeah. The Fed should never be competing with the U.S. Treasury in the marketplace because those reserves that the Fed pays interest on and the reverse repurchase agreements, those are T-bills. Those are effectively the same thing as a T-bill. So we have to put some operating rules in place for the Fed that will constrain their progressive action without destroying the good part of having a reserve bank. Because, otherwise we go back to 1860. And I don't think that's a good idea.
Right. Well, I mean, so, what you're talking about in housing and financial sectors, I mean, that's probably has a longer horizon in terms of structural change. But there's some other things I wanted to get your temperature on too that maybe have more short-term boost, like for example, unleashing America's domestic energy production, and as we talked about at the open, leveraging our relationships with our erstwhile allies in Western Europe to stop buying LNG from Russia and to start buying LNG from us, those sorts of things. So energy production and more aggressive sale of American energy overseas, that seems to me an opportunity to at least start lowering one of the cost centers for American families, which is the cost of energy. And,
absolutely.
Right? I mean, is that perhaps the most accessible, immediate cost relief area of cost relief?
Oh, very definitely. Look at New York. The progressive answer to global warming has been to raise everybody's energy costs. I think we have to accept the fact that for both long-term and short-term reasons, the weather is warmer than it's been in the past. How do we deal with this? We focus on remediation. We help people in flood-prone areas and maybe even areas that weren't flood-prone in the past. But we got to stop trying to pretend that we can roll back what the planet is doing. Okay, one of the craziest things I've heard coming from progressives is this notion that we can stop global warming. They've turned this into a global crusade. No, we have to remediate global warming, and that's the responsible way to do it. We need energy. This economy is not going to function if the Democrats keep deliberately raising the cost of electricity, gas, everything else, because that's their button. That's what they do. They love raising prices. Here in New York, it's crazy. They're building windmills that will never, ever be cash positive. And over time, they're going to be a terrible expense when you have to start replacing them. But this is their answer. This is what they come up with when they have this.
Yeah, this is this is Biden out the door. We still have $1 billion worth of infrastructure spend that's just being deployed now. That should be clawed back, as far as I'm concerned.
I think we can address a lot of the issues that the public is concerned about, but do so in a responsible way and say to them, look, just being progressive crazies is not the answer. You have to have competent people who know the subject matter, who know how to get things done. In my world, housing, The past 4 years under Joe Biden were a complete disaster. We had one attractive, person of the right age and the right color who had no idea about finance. We just put them in place, and it was a fiasco. So I think just getting rid of that, changing some of the policy priorities, it's going to have a huge positive impact on the economy. If you can show progress on the deficit, Dan, even modestly, rates are going to fall. There's so much demand for U.S. Treasury securities, Ginnie Mae's, what we call risk-free assets, that if you stop issuing them, if you reduce the amount of debt that the Treasury is accumulating every year, the rates will fall. You won't even have to worry about Jay Powell. He'll leave. But, going back to your question about Powell, it is important, but let's not waste time on Jay Powell. If he wants to sit there and quote unquote defend his institution, fine. We should focus on Capitol Hill and pass legislation to limit the ability of the Fed to cause problems, because they cause home prices to go up too much. That's Jay Powell. And I must say, he's been a disaster. If we had more time, I'd walk you through it. But he's screwed up several times during his term. He should be out the door. And it's very simple. Fed chairman can't function without the support of the White House and the Secretary of the Treasury at the end of the day. I would like to see the Secretary of the Treasury put back on the Federal Reserve Board as an observer. I think that would be very positive. Before we created the Board of Governors, the Treasury Secretary was on the board.
Maybe if the Treasury Secretary is John Paulson, but that Captain Kangaroo impersonator who's the Treasury Secretary now, I mean, she's out over her skis almost as badly as Biden is when it comes to these matters.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Look, Janet Yellen was never qualified for that position. She's a sweet economist who likes to talk about housing. But really, she was way over her skis. Look, think about non-banks. She's been fretting about the problem of non-bank finance for 4 years. And yet those companies have been the most durable and the most resilient of anything in finance. They're always looking in the wrong places, Dan. But I think Paulson would be a great Treasury Secretary, by the way. Mnuchin was good too. We need people who understand the subject matter of their jobs. That should be the litmus test.
That seems like a pretty reasonable baseline.
But it hasn't been. We've had a collection of characters.
I know.
It's really been mind-boggling.
But I agree with you too. I mean, the Jay Powell thing, focus on what you control, and what you control is Capitol Hill, what you control is the executive branch, and there's plenty of work to do there. And if you do the work there, then Jay Powell's influence really is, is marginal at best. But now so a little bit of housing. We haven't really talked about food prices, but I mean, commodity prices are sort of built into this larger conversation, including the the inputs, which is energy prices we were talking about. The other thing, though, that I want to get your reaction to, an assessment of, since one of the things that's mitigated the increased costs for everything is the sugar high that the markets have been on, thanks in part to Jay Powell, as you were mentioning, that has, sort of buoyed people's 401k. So even if they're a little cash poor now, at least they feel a little bit better about their 401k performance. But I wonder where you see risk assets, given the response that the markets had and the crypto markets had to Trump's victory.
I think you're going to see a bit of a bump. We already have seen it. I put out a piece this morning, basically saying, is JP Morgan overinflated? There is inflation in financial assets. Bank stocks didn't go up 20%, 30% over the last 6 months just because of Donald Trump. They went up because there's endemic secular inflation in our markets that have caused them to go up. Now, if we start getting the budget deficit under control, if we put some limits on the Fed and their ability to cause trouble, because let's face it, they cause inflation. We should state that explicitly. Then all of a sudden the markets are going to be a little less exciting, but that's okay. Because if home price inflation stops, and if you see inflation generally start to moderate, then all of a sudden we can get the economy back onto a little more stable track than it is now. We're on boom and bust. That's what we've been doing for the past 20, 30 years. And it's largely because we kept using inflation or interest rates to goose short-term economic growth, but it wasn't real. It's like Jimmy Grant wrote in a couple of his books. Was that incremental dollar of GDP real, or was it just a phantom? I think it was a phantom. We want real growth. We want money in our people's pockets that isn't going to lose value every day. And then all of a sudden, I think we're going to be in a good place. You know who my model is, Dan? Mr. Millet down in Argentina.
Yeah,
We
right.
almost have to follow his playbook. It's not as bad in the U.S. because people still use the dollar as the means of exchange, but we should take these issues seriously because he's fighting the same battle we have to fight.
Well, right. I mean, the way that the DC press corps is going to cover any sort of quote unquote austerity program is, first of all, to call it an austerity program because it sounds ominous. But but belt tightening for the government is not austerity for the private sector. It's stimulus, and I think
Yeah.
this is what in part the Trump administration needs to sell, not just the president himself. They need to sell the idea that the big takeaway from the deterioration in the quality of life was big government policy. You're talking about everybody's focused on the results, inflation in food prices and energy prices and home prices, but it's the underlying central planning. And if we just replace our central planners, their central planners with our central planners, we're going to make the same mistakes because we'll never have the knowledge that the market has. It needs to be a little bit of I think this is a little bit of an opportunity for an Econ 101 lesson.
Oh, it totally is. And it goes even deeper than that. I think if we can start to get people focused on the fact that when we reduce government, all of a sudden there's going to be more money out there for the private sector. Imagine if we could get credit card rates down below 20%. Well, you can do that because the banks are hungry. If you start forcing interest rates down by doing the right thing in terms of fiscal policy, all of a sudden they're going to be competing for those customers harder and harder. They're going to have to cut their interest rates. So there's a huge payoff here if Republicans are willing to go back to basics, talk about fiscal discipline, maybe even start paying off the debt. Because you got to remember something. We don't get much bang for the buck when we issue a new dollar of debt today. The returns are very, very small. And we're sitting there financing spending that occurred 20, 30 years ago,
Right.
which has no impact on the economy at all. It's simply for the convenience of investors. Imagine if investors couldn't buy all the Treasury bills they wanted to buy. Imagine if money market funds had to start widening their criteria to own private assets, which I think would be a very good thing. We're talking about, Dan, bringing risk and reward back to the front, okay? And saying
Right.
these are the important things.
Well, I mean, as a former Illinois resident, I mean, I know the model very, very well. I mean, this is pay for your mortgage on your credit card, right? And you're just financing debt in perpetuity, and that's what we've been doing, right?
That's right. If we even started to reduce the amount of total debt by a modest amount, generate a little surplus so we can take care of Social Security, okay? You're never going to win an election again. I mean, you'll lose an election again. That's exactly where we have to go with this. We have to give the old people a reason to vote Republican, and we have to essentially say to the world, follow us. The age of just issuing more and more debt and leaving your children and your grandchildren in poverty is not acceptable. And you know what? You do that, we don't have to worry about the Chinese or the Russians.
I mean, I hate to, yeah,
those are failed states.
I hate to deviate from this sort of Norman Vincent Peale moment we're having here of optimism, but I mean,
well, we haven't tried it in so long. When I worked for Kemp, these were ideas that we were willing to talk about publicly. The Republicans have given up over the last 20 years. We got to change that.
What about Trump's pronouncements is the most concerning to you in terms of sidetracking some of his better ideas that you think will be pro-growth and extend opportunities? Is his favorite word in the dictionary, according to him, tariffs? Is that the thing that most concerns you?
No, I'm actually editing my first book, which is going to be re-released next year, Inflated Money, Debt, and the American Dream. And people have to realize that we had high tariffs in this country throughout the 19th century. The notion that tariffs somehow caused the Great Depression is wrong. You know, the tariffs that were raised right before the Depression with Smoot-Hawley were largely agricultural, and they were there to protect American farmers. So I personally think, we live in Disney World. People have to pay to get in. And I like Trump's approach. I like his approach to China. You have to be careful with tariffs. We don't want to go after our friends. But with China, absolutely. They are the ultimate modern mercantilist society. They do not want fair dealing with the rest of the world. They are just predators, and we have to treat them accordingly.
So what? So what? If is there something that Trump has proposed that's central to his economic vision that does concern you? Or are you
No,
pretty
not
content?
really.
You're pretty
I think
content.
it will get worked on and moderated as we go through the legislative process, as it should be. But I think his instincts are very good. There's times when he says things he doesn't really mean, but that's okay. That's politics. I think people are going to be surprised at how much better run Trump 2 is than Trump 1. And I
Yeah,
think we're going to get a lot more done. And I'm
yeah,
looking forward to it.
yeah. No, I agree with you on that. I mean, all the early signs, the framing of these issue sectors, and the
Yeah.
specific, the specificity and the talent that is on board and being discussed. It's a completely different thing than 2017. There's no question about that.
Well,
So
he's
we'll
playing
see.
for the exit this
Execution
time.
matter. Yeah, execution
That's
still
right.
matters. Yeah. Now, but
Well,
so right, but if those things for whatever reason don't come to pass, and you have the Fed behaving a year or 2 years from now the same way they are now, and you don't have sort of the fiscal reckoning that we're discussing, um, then where do we find ourselves in terms of the economic vitality of the country? And I'm thinking specifically of, so the Fed continues to devalue the currency, and yet we have this cryptocurrency revolution that some say is happening, that others are more skeptical of, but that moves not those cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin sort of move with the market. So it doesn't seem like it's a hedge on the dollar, or it's a hedge on inflation. So how does crypto factor into this conversation about the success or failure of more responsible fiscal and monetary policy?
well, if we don't do anything about the budget deficit, if we don't address some of the issues you just ticked off, Dan, then cryptocurrencies are going to become more and more attractive simply because people are going to be looking to flee the dollar, the fiat legal tender dollar, and go into something else. The crypto people are kind of like the gold rushers from the 1840s. I don't see crypto as a solution. I think it's a phenomenon that's interesting. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but I do think that we have a great opportunity to address basic structural issues in this economy. And if we do, interest rates are going to fall. Growth is going to be well above that 3% that conservatives cautiously talk about, right? They're almost shy about it. And we won't have to worry about things like crypto. It won't even matter. People will be out buying real estate. But, to your earlier question, let me just say this. How do you fix home prices? How do you fix some of the other things that are wrong with real estate today? You need an old-fashioned recession, but that's hard to do when you have $35 trillion in debt. The Fed has been biased towards debt, and they've been managing this economy in such a way that you don't have a deflation. Maybe we need a little deflation, and that's how you fix this. I hate to say it. I think we're going to have a housing reset in a couple of years. 27, 28 is my expectation. And that could take home prices back down to 2020 levels. That's how much
What
air
what
we have in the housing market.
what do you think? Why do we still have 2 years of runway before there's a housing market correction?
There's still so much liquidity in the system, number one, chasing assets of all descriptions. Interest rates are still not that high. If you really wanted to crush housing, you needed to get mortgage rates up to 8, 9, 10%. And the Fed was not willing to go there. The Fed really hasn't tightened. If you look at the numbers, they didn't reduce reserves at all. That's not really tightening. So this is a very progressive Fed. If you had really wanted to fix home prices, you need to get rates higher, leave them there for 6 months, and then you would have seen the housing market come off. That will happen naturally in a couple of years. My source for this, by the way, is Stan Middleman in the bio I just published. He's one of the smartest people in mortgage finance, the head of Freedom Mortgage. He's a very, very good judge of cycles in economics.
I wanted to address big blue city America, because I know you're a New York City guy, was for a long time, and I'm Chicago. And the experience of blue cities this election cycle was kind of interesting, because you saw Trump outperform previous vote totals in some of the metropolitan areas, and sort of the coalition groups within big diverse cities. But you also saw things like London Breed lose the mayor's race in San Francisco over the issue of public safety, and George Gascon lose the LA prosecutor's race over the issue of public safety. It didn't happen everywhere. You had ballot initiatives in Arizona and California that were in the direction of law and order in reaction to disorder, not just violent crime, but sort of general disorder in urban centers. As I mentioned at the outset, you have Eric Adams talking very differently, actually in the last couple of weeks of the election and since, about things like illegal immigration than he had been talking about for most of his term to this point. And I just wonder what you think is happening in places like New York City and Chicago and San Francisco and LA. It's not uniform, but I mean, there are similar people pursuing similar policies with similar results, all terrible. And some are receiving a bit of a reckoning, and others may have a reckoning in the offing. And just how you think that plays off, because of course these big urban centers are hugely important to the local and state economies in which they are located, but also collectively to the national economy.
The blue cities present us with a very difficult problem, but it's a familiar problem. If you go back 100 years ago when people were moving to the cities, what was the big problem? Inflation, cost of housing, cost of food. So that hasn't changed. The trouble is that these are very expensive places to live. There is no way to make New York City affordable, as you and I have talked about on your radio program. So how do you help people? I think, honestly, I would encourage them to move to other communities. There is no way for a low-income household to survive in New York City. It's just impossible. And they try and subsidize it. They try and, make it tolerable. But there's no way for a developer to build new affordable housing in Queens or Brooklyn, New York, because of the cost of acquiring the property and building. It's just too high. So I think Republicans need to start changing the conversation with respect to urban development. We can use the crisis in commercial real estate as a lever, by the way, and start to help redeveloping some of these cities and take credit for it. There's no reason why Republicans can't help to remake and recast these cities in a more practical way than what we have today, which is the progressives have chased most of the money out of Chicago, New York, San Francisco. And so there's no capital left to talk about it, affordable housing. It's absurd. We might as well not even bring it up. So the question is, can we change the national conversation, discredit the progressive notion of subsidies and socialism, and start to, help people build what we need, which is affordable housing? Think about all the landlords and developers who got shellacked during COVID when people didn't have to pay their rent. Do you think anybody in Washington thought about that? No, they just had to take the losses. So for a lot of people in today's market, the big developers are down in Florida and Texas and the Carolinas. They don't want to know about the blue cities. That's the last thing they want to talk about. We have to change that, because ultimately, if we don't, then these cities are going to become a big problem. They're going to become a center for crime.
Bigger problem.
Much bigger. And it's going to be impossible for the cities to manage it.
But
you can't manage New York City without a business community. That's what it comes down to.
Well, so give me an example of like a concrete vision for, say, what I know, the financial district, LaSalle Street in Chicago, which is you walk down there during the day and it's a ghost town, where the exchanges were at the banks and insurance. It's a ghost town. So what do you do with all that empty commercial space? I mean, the BLM Brandon Johnson, the mayor, is talking about basically, building ghettos, doing Cabrini Green 2.0 in places like the financial district. But obviously that's a terrible idea. But what, without becoming too central planner-ish, what can you do? What should we do?
Ultimately, you've got to knock it down and repurpose it for a different economy. These cities were built for an economy that existed 100 years ago. The Dutch built New York City for commerce. That's really it. It was not built as a nice place to live. It's built to be concentrated and very efficient. So the question is, how do we want these cities to look in the future? I think the Republicans ought to take this issue, make it their own, have a national commission that looks at this, and then we need the federal government to help finance it. This is, Imagine another Robert Moses. I hate to put it that way, but that's what you need in these cities. You need somebody who's willing to say, no, that doesn't work. We have to do this again. But the trouble is, my ancestors were sandhogs. They built a lot of New York City. Imagine the cost of that labor today in today's market.
Right.
So we have to come up with smarter ways to do things. We have to be willing to admit that certain patterns, like imagine downtown New York below 34th Street. Most of that real estate needs to be knocked down and repurposed if it hasn't been built in this century, okay? Some of it goes back literally to Tammany Hall. We got to change and break that mold. And guess what? Politically, the Republicans will benefit from that. Because big cities are largely collectivist aggregations anyway. That's why we have them. People like to live together. It's a human nature.
Just as an aside, New York State on the presidential, I know Eric Adams' approval ratings are not that high. I know there's a lot of buyer's remorse with Kathy Hochul, who just won, who barely beat Lee Zeldin by like 4 or 5 points.
I know.
But then in the presidential, it stretched back out to double digits in favor of Kamala Harris. And I just wonder, is there going to be a big? I'm still waiting for that big blue city in a big blue state to break, for critical mass to get to. We have to do something completely different. And I don't mean one policy area, and I don't mean replacing one far leftist with one not just a little less far leftist. I mean something completely different. I'm waiting for that to happen, and I'm still not sure where it's going to
pop. I think you have the possibility of, let's look what Trump did with Latino men and Black men. Right. I think you can build on that. I think if you slice it horizontally instead of vertically, left and right, I think you come at it in a different way and you say to people, do you want jobs? Do you want a decent place to live? Do you want a secure community where you don't have to worry about being mugged? That's how you address this, because the Democrats have lost all credibility on those key issues. We just have to be able to find people that want to make the case. I'll tell you, I would love to get involved in politics here in New York, because I think there's a way to do this by appealing to the Catholic vote and appealing to people who run their own businesses. I live in Austin, New York, down the bottom of the town. This whole town has been remade by the Latin community. They come here from, Latin America, wherever they're from. They build businesses, they build churches. They have totally remade the Hudson Valley. And you know what? They're just like my relatives from Sicily 100 years ago. I think it's great. And that's the way you win elections.
So we should be worrying about those first and second generation entrepreneurs, and less
make
about
them Republicans. And we got to go back and get the Black community too. There's so many people in the Black community who would like to have an alternative. Right. The most stunning thing is in New York, the Jewish community continues to support the Democrats. They refuse to vote for anybody else. I think you can make a case to them and change that.
Well, and so that means that we can pay a lot less attention. I'm hoping you'll say yes, not to the rawful suburban honky women, the rich, angry, white leftist women in the wealthy enclaves, and their C-suite Fortune 500 husbands. We can stop paying attention to them.
That's right, because you're not going to win the election by catering to them. You're only going to win the election by starting from the bottom and taking away more of that market than the Democrats are going to get. That's how you win elections in states like New York and New Jersey. And I think we can do it. We need a candidate who actually speaks Spanish. All right? I'm married to a beautiful Latina from Uruguay. So trust me, everybody we know in the Latin community voted for Trump in New York. He actually did very well in New York. And I think in the future, a younger candidate, it could be his vice president, could be a new candidate, could be a woman at the top of the Republican ticket next time. But we need to speak Spanish. Hablamos español, because these people are the future. And that's how you build a majority for the Republican Party.
It's a wonderful accent, too, on your Spanish. Very, very nicely done.
Well, I grew up with Italian. My mother and father would argue in the kitchen late at night and, make babies. That's how it works. The Irish and the Italians have been coming together in New York for a long time.
Yeah. Christopher Whalen, investment banker, author of Forward Men, editor of the Institutional Risk Analyst. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate all your insights.
My pleasure, Dan. Let's do it again.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.